I knew something was wrong before my truck even stopped rolling. You ever get that feeling where your stomach drops before your brain catches up, like your body already knows you're about to walk into a disaster? Yeah, that was me pulling onto Briar Glen Road at almost midnight on a Friday, dead tired after a 12-hour shift, coffee cold in the cup holder, country radio humming low, and then suddenly my headlights hit this giant wall of fresh cedar planks right across my driveway. I slammed the brakes so hard my toolbox flew off the passenger seat. At first, I honestly thought somebody had crashed a construction trailer into my property or something, because there was no way, absolutely no way, somebody had actually built a fence across my driveway while I was at work. But then I saw the little laminated notice zip-tied to the wood, flapping in the wind like it was proud of itself. Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. Unauthorized access point permanently closed pending community enforcement action. I just sat there staring at it, engine running, one hand gripping the steering wheel, so hard my knuckles started turning white. And the thing that really got me wasn't even the fence, it was that word. Unauthorized. Like I was some stranger trespassing on my own land after living there for 22 years. That driveway had been there longer than half the people in that neighborhood. My dad and grandfather laid the original gravel themselves back in the early 80s, hauling crushed limestone in an old rusted Ford dump truck that barely made it uphill. I grew up riding bikes down that driveway, learning how to throw a baseball out there, washing my first truck there with my little sister spraying water everywhere while my mom yelled from the porch about wasting it. Every birthday, every Christmas, every funeral, every important memory somehow started with tires rolling up that gravel road toward the house. So seeing a 6-foot fence blocking it felt weirdly personal, like somebody had walked into a church and spray-painted over family photos. Now technically, Cedar Ridge wasn't even supposed to exist back when my parents bought the property. This whole area used to be farmland until developers moved in around 15 years ago and started building those big beige copy-paste houses with stone mailboxes and HOA newsletters telling grown adults what color flowers they were allowed to plant. Most of the newer neighbors kept to themselves. Honestly, they were fine, but the HOA board, man, those people treated neighborhood rules like they were running a small dictatorship. Especially this one guy, Randall Pike. Randall was the HOA president and the kind of man who smiled without warmth, if that makes sense. Always wore golf polos tucked into jeans. Always talking like he was moderating a courtroom instead of discussing mailbox paint. I'd had problems with him before. Nothing huge at first. Petty stuff. He once sent me a violation notice because my fishing boat was visible from the street for an excessive amount of time. Another time he complained my porch lights were too warm-toned and didn't match community standards. I laughed the first few years because honestly, who has the energy to fight over porch bulbs? But over time I started noticing something. Randall hated that my property existed outside HOA control. My land technically bordered the subdivision without fully belonging to it. The driveway crossed a recorded easement near the entrance road, and I think that drove him insane because it was one thing he couldn't regulate. I called the number on the notice right there from the truck. Didn't even wait until morning. It rang twice before Randall answered, sounding way too awake for midnight. "Mr. Lawson," he said calmly, almost amused. "I figured you'd call eventually." I said, "Tell me why there's a damn fence blocking my driveway." And he actually laughed. Not loud. Just this little smug breath through his nose like he'd been waiting years for this moment. "Well," he said, "after reviewing community land surveys, the board voted to reclaim unauthorized access usage across HOA property." I remember blinking at the windshield trying to process the sentence because it sounded like something written by a guy who enjoys hearing himself talk. "You reclaimed my driveway. The easement issue has been reevaluated." "No," I snapped. "An easement doesn't get reevaluated because you people suddenly feel powerful." There was this pause, and then he lowered his voice real calm. "Nathan, your property lowers adjacent home values. We've been patient about it for years." That hit me harder than I expected. Not angry at first, just cold. Because suddenly this wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. My dad passed away 3 years earlier. My mom had moved into assisted living that spring, and I was the last one still holding onto the house. Randall knew that. Everybody did. And hearing him talk about my home like it was some stain on the neighborhood made something shift inside me. I said, "You realize I have legal access rights, right?" And he answered, "Then I guess you're free to challenge it." Real casual. like he already thought he'd won. I hung up before I said something stupid, sat there in the dark for maybe 10 minutes listening to the engine idle, staring at that fence while porch lights flicked on in nearby houses. Curtains moved. People were watching. Nobody came outside, though. Nobody wanted to get involved with the HOA. That's the thing about those neighborhoods. Everybody complains privately, but publicly they nod along because fines and letters are easier than confrontation. Eventually, I backed the truck out onto the road and parked half a mile away near the old feed store lot, then carried groceries through the muddy rear access trail with my boots sinking into wet dirt the whole way. Somewhere around my second trip carrying bags, I realized Randall had made one huge mistake. He thought this was just inconvenience. He thought eventually I'd get tired, give up, maybe sell the property, and disappear quietly. What he didn't understand was, my grandfather survived losing a farm during the recession. My dad worked 30 years laying asphalt in Tennessee heat just to keep this property in the family. And me? I might not look impressive standing there covered in mud carrying Walmart bags through the woods at 1 in the morning, but I can be unbelievably stubborn when somebody tries to erase my family like we never belonged there in the first place. The next morning, I pulled every dusty box out of the hallway closet and spread paperwork all over my kitchen table like some half-drunk detective in a crime movie. Old tax records, faded surveys, utility maps, insurance folders. Years of paperwork my mother refused to throw away because, according to her, one day you'll thank me. Turns out she was right. Around noon, I finally found the original county deed folded inside a cracked leather binder my dad used to keep in his workshop. And there it was, plain as day, stamped and recorded back in 1983. A permanent right-of-way easement extending through what later became Cedar Ridge subdivision property. Legal access to the Lawson residence. Unrestricted and irrevocable. I actually laughed when I read the word irrevocable. Not because it was funny, because suddenly the whole thing became so unbelievably stupid. Randall hadn't just crossed a line morally. He'd stepped directly into legal quicksand wearing dress shoes. But here's the thing people don't understand about anger. Real anger doesn't always explode right away. Sometimes it gets quiet first. Focused. That weekend I stopped yelling, stopped pacing, stopped fantasizing about ripping the fence down with my truck bumper, and started making copies. Lots of copies. Monday morning, I walked into the county clerk's office carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. The woman behind the desk, older lady named Denise with silver glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, looked through the easement paperwork for maybe 30 seconds before raising her eyebrows. "Oh," she said softly. "Well, this is going to be a problem for them." Apparently, Randall and the HOA never filed any legal challenge against the easement because they knew they'd lose. Instead, they just voted internally to restrict visual blight access corridors, which is HOA language for, "we don't like looking at your property." They figured if they built the fence confidently enough, maybe I'd panic and fold before getting lawyers involved. Denise filed the complaint immediately and contacted county code enforcement while I sat there drinking burnt coffee from a styrofoam cup, trying not to smile too hard. She even printed me a temporary emergency access notice in case law enforcement needed proof before the county investigation wrapped up. Now here's where things started getting entertaining. By Wednesday morning, a county inspector named Eli Vargas showed up at my property wearing steel-toe boots and carrying one of those giant measuring wheels. Eli looked exactly like the kind of guy who enjoys catching people breaking rules. Mid-50s, sunburned neck, mustache straight out of a 1987 Sheriff Department calendar. We walked the property together while I explained the situation, and halfway through his inspection, he stopped dead near the fence line and just stared at something. Then he muttered, "Well, hell." I said, "What?" He pointed his pen toward the road entrance. "These idiots didn't just block your easement. Turns out the HOA fence extended nearly 4 feet into county right-of-way territory. And not just any right-of-way either. It was part of the emergency access corridor connected to the entire cul-de-sac beyond Cedar Ridge's west entrance. Meaning technically, by building that fence, the HOA interfered with legal emergency vehicle access for every house at the end of the subdivision. When Eli explained that, I remember physically leaning back against my truck, trying not to grin like a maniac. Because suddenly, this wasn't Nathan Lawson versus the HOA anymore. Now it was the county versus the HOA. And county officials do not enjoy paperwork created by arrogant suburban board members. That afternoon, Randall came flying down my gravel driveway in a golf cart looking like his blood pressure had reached medically historic levels. I was sitting on the porch drinking sweet tea when he stormed up waving county notices in his hand. "You filed against us?" he barked. I took a slow sip and said, "Looks like. You blindsided the board. You built a fence across my driveway." His jaw tightened. "You could have handled this privately." That almost made me laugh. "Randall, you zip-tied a legal threat to a cedar wall in front of my house." For a second I thought he might actually calm down, but instead he stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You have any idea what kind of financial damage this could cause the community?" And there it was. Not apology, not accountability. Money. I looked at him and realized something weirdly sad. Men like Randall don't actually think they're villains. They genuinely believe control equals order, and anybody resisting them becomes the problem. Somewhere along the line, this guy convinced himself he was protecting property values from people like me, regular folks hanging on to older homes while subdivisions swallowed everything around us. I said, "You know what my dad used to say? People who care more about appearances than fairness eventually embarrass themselves." Randall scoffed. "Your father never understood progress." Man, that one landed. My dad worked himself into chronic back pain, paving roads across 3 counties. He coached Little League for kids whose parents never showed up. Half the older residents around there still waved when they passed because he'd helped them during floods back in the 90s. Hearing Randall dismiss him like that flipped some switch in me I didn't know existed. I stood up slowly and said, "Get off my property." He stared at me a second too long before turning back toward the golf cart, muttering, "This isn't over." And honestly, he was right, because the county inspection report got worse every day. Over the next week, I learned the HOA never secured proper permits for the fence installation, violated setback regulations, interfered with drainage grading, and accidentally obstructed utility access markers near the road entrance. It was like watching somebody fail an open book exam in real time. Then neighbors started talking, quietly at first. One older couple stopped me while I was getting mail and whispered they thought the HOA had gone too far. Another guy admitted Randall pushed the fence vote through during a meeting while describing my property as a deteriorating holdout parcel. Apparently, several residents objected, but nobody wanted confrontation. That's how these communities work sometimes. Fear wrapped in politeness. Then came the emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but according to my neighbor Claire, who absolutely lived for neighborhood drama, the HOA board meeting turned into a complete bloodbath. Residents were furious after learning county fines could increase HOA dues for everyone. One woman apparently stood up and yelled, "You people started a land war over gravel," which honestly deserves to be framed somewhere. And the best part? Randall still refused to back down. The HOA attorney advised immediate fence removal to minimize liability, but Randall argued removing it would signal weakness and encourage residents to challenge future HOA authority. That right there tells you everything you need to know about the guy. It was never about safety or regulations or aesthetics. He couldn't stand losing control publicly, so the county made the decision for them. 8 days later, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines outside my house. I stepped onto the porch with coffee in hand and nearly burst out laughing. County crews had arrived with trucks, equipment, and a full removal order. Orange safety vests everywhere, clipboards, flashing lights, the whole show. And standing near the road in khaki shorts looking absolutely devastated was Randall. I walked down slowly while workers started tearing apart the fence panel by panel. Cedar boards cracked, nails screeched loose, dust floated through the morning sunlight. Honestly, it felt cinematic. Randall saw me approaching and immediately started ranting about appeals and procedural misconduct, but nobody was listening anymore. Not the workers, not the county supervisor. Not even the residents gathering outside with coffee mugs watching the HOA unravel in real time. One older guy actually clapped when the main section came down. Randall pointed at me and snapped, "You think you won something here?" I looked past him at the broken fence piled in the grass and said, "No, I think you lost something." He frowned. "What's that?" And I told him the truth. The second people stopped fearing you. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't have a response. You'd think that would have been the end of it, right? Fence comes down, county slaps them around a little, everybody goes home embarrassed and hopefully wiser. Honestly, part of me wanted that too. I was exhausted by then. For almost 3 weeks, my life had turned into legal paperwork, muddy boots, county calls, neighbors whispering across driveways like we were living inside some suburban courtroom drama. But every time I thought about letting it go, I'd remember standing there in the dark that first night, staring at that fence while people watched from behind curtains like I was the intruder. And the more I sat with that feeling, the more I realized this wasn't just about access anymore. It was about humiliation. Randall wanted me to feel small, temporary, like my family's history could be erased with a board vote and a power drill. So I called a lawyer. Not some giant expensive firm either. Just a local property attorney named Donna Mercer, who looked sweet enough to bake cookies for church events until she started discussing easement law and suddenly sounded like she could dismantle governments for fun. I brought her the documents, the county reports, photos of the fence, towing receipts from having to park down the road, everything. She flipped through the folder quietly for maybe 15 minutes before looking up and saying, "Nathan, these people handed you a case wrapped in a bow." Now I'll admit something here that probably makes me sound petty. The first time Donna mentioned emotional distress damages, I laughed. I said, "Come on, nobody's emotionally distressed over a driveway." And she just looked at me and said, "You stopped being able to access your home. Your neighbors were encouraged to view you as illegitimate, and you were publicly threatened with property seizure. That affects people more than they realize." That stuck with me, because truthfully, I hadn't been sleeping much. Every time headlights slowed near my property, I'd look out the window expecting another HOA notice. I caught myself feeling weirdly anxious mowing my own lawn, like somebody was going to tell me I needed permission for that too. It sounds ridiculous until you've dealt with people trying to weaponize bureaucracy against your everyday life. So we filed trespassing, obstruction of legal access, property interference, financial damages, emotional distress, and suddenly Randall stopped acting confident. The mediation happened about 2 months later inside this bland little county office conference room with flickering fluorescent lights and stale coffee that tasted like despair. Randall showed up with 2 board members and the HOA attorney, and man, they looked rough, tired, defensive, like people who'd spent weeks getting yelled at by angry residents over rising legal fees. Randall wouldn't even look at me at first. Donna laid everything out methodically, almost casually. County violations, recorded easement, improper construction, financial losses, public harassment. She didn't raise her voice once. Didn't need to. The facts were doing all the heavy lifting by then. At one point, the mediator asked Randall directly, "Did the HOA knowingly obstruct access to a legally protected easement?" And this man, this grown man who spent years acting like king of the subdivision, actually tried saying, "We believe community interest justified temporary intervention." Donna leaned back in her chair and said, "That's a very creative way to describe illegal obstruction." I swear I almost choked trying not to laugh. The settlement took 4 hours. By the end of it, the HOA agreed to pay me $8,500 for damages and legal costs, formally acknowledge the easement permanently with updated county recording protections, and issue written guarantees prohibiting future interference with property access. But the real damage wasn't even my settlement check. It was the county fines. Because while we were busy fighting over my driveway, investigators uncovered multiple unrelated HOA violations involving drainage compliance and unauthorized landscaping modifications near utility easements. Apparently, once county officials start digging, they don't stop at one hole. Cedar Ridge got hammered financially. HOA dues increased almost immediately. Residents were furious. Board members started resigning within months. One family moved away entirely after getting stuck with a special assessment fee nobody saw coming. And Randall? He technically stayed on the board for a while, but according to Claire, nobody respected him anymore. Every neighborhood meeting turned hostile. Every decision got challenged. People who'd stayed quiet for years suddenly started pushing back on everything from parking fines to mailbox regulations. Funny how fear disappears once somebody finally says no. A few months later, I saw Randall at the hardware store. First time since mediation. We ended up standing in the same checkout line surrounded by bags of mulch and garden hoses like 2 exhausted dads at a suburban showdown nobody asked for. He looked older somehow, less polished. For a second, I considered ignoring him. But then he glanced over and said, real quietly, "You know, this neighborhood was peaceful before all this." And I remember staring at him thinking, this guy still doesn't get it. So I told him, peaceful for who? He didn't answer, because deep down he knew the truth. A place isn't peaceful just because nobody complains. Sometimes people stay quiet because they think speaking up won't matter. That was the last real conversation we ever had. These days I still live in the same house. Same creaky porch steps. Same gravel driveway. Every now and then I catch newer neighbors slowing down near the entrance because they've heard some version of the story. Around Cedar Ridge, it's practically local folklore now. Depending on who you ask, I'm either the stubborn guy who defended his family property or the asshole who destroyed the HOA budget over a driveway dispute. And honestly, maybe there's truth in both. Because if I'm being fair, the fallout hit people who never touched that fence. Some residents got higher dues despite disagreeing with Randall from the start. Some families just wanted quiet neighborhoods and ended up trapped inside this ridiculous legal circus none of them asked for. I think about that sometimes. But then I remember standing in the rain carrying groceries through mud because a group of strangers decided my family home was an eyesore standing in the way of their perfect little community image. And every single time I drive up that gravel driveway now, I still slow down near the entrance. Mostly because there's a brand new county sign posted there that makes me smile every time I see it. Public access easement. Do not obstruct. Sometimes karma doesn't show up dramatically. Sometimes it's just a little metal sign reminding certain people they were never as powerful as they thought they were. And honestly, I'm curious what you would have done in my position. Would you have stopped after the fence came down? Or would you have pushed all the way through like I did? Because some people online said I defended my rights, and others said I ruined an entire neighborhood just to prove a point. So let me know down in the comments, who do you think was really wrong here?